I'm going to say a few words of introduction. I had the pleasure for the first time this morning to get to know personally Professor Jean Krasno, who is an associate research scientist and lecturer in political science at Yale University. She's a distinguished fellow in international security studies, and Dr. Krasno's areas of interest are the United Nations, international organizations, and UN peacekeeping. From 1998 until 2003, Dr. Krasno served as the executive director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Currently, she is also a full-time lecturer at the City College of New York, where she directs the Multilateralism and International Organization Initiative. Dr. Krasno has been authorized by the former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan to organize his papers for publication, a project which is housed within the Colin Powell Center for Policy Studies. Professor Krasno received her PhD from the City University of New York Graduate Center and has published several prominent works on the United Nations. Today, Dr. Krasno will be speaking about the topic, Kofi Annan, the role of the Secretary-General and the rule of law. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Professor Jean Krasno. Thank you. Welcome again. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you very, very much. To add just a couple of things to my introduction, because they may be of interest to you. At Yale University, we spent several years doing an oral history of the United Nations, and we interviewed people within the UN as well as parties or former parties to a conflict on a number of different, mostly security-oriented issues. And that collection of about 200 oral histories is here at the Dag Hammarskjöld Library and is available for people to use as resources. And little by little, the library is putting them up on the internet so that you can also access them, some of them now on the internet. Also, he mentioned the Kofi Annan papers. So this is going to be coming out in a few weeks. I've been working on it since early 2006, and actually really preparing for it since 2003. So it's been a long project, and these papers will be available to the general public, first of all, as a set of books. It's 5,000 pages, so it's 5 volumes of 1,000 pages each, published by Lynn Reiner Publishers, and we're going to be launching the book on March 19th here in New York. So hopefully some of you can come to that. And in that is his public papers, which I'm going to be referring to a little bit here, in terms of speeches, press conferences, other kinds of interviews and things that he did publicly, but also handwritten notes, notes between himself and the different department undersecretaries general or deputy secretary general, to give an idea of how policy is created. And so the theme that I was looking for in reading all the papers, 900,000 documents, was to find the threads of various different ideas that eventually blossomed throughout his 10 years as Secretary General. So hopefully they will also be available and useful to people who want to do research on the UN and the Secretary General. But really it covers everything in the world, because everything comes to the UN at some point. So that's just a little bit to promote research. As an academic, I'm always interested in that. Well, what I'm going to be talking about today is the role of the Secretary General of the UN in international law, and to also talk about the fact that the Secretary General really has no power. I mean, we look at the UN as if it were a government. Someone asked that question. And it's not a government. It is involved in governance, but it in itself is not a government. So while the Secretary General looks like a president, he does not have any of the powers that a president of a national country has. He has no military, and he has no real resources. He has a small amount of funds for specific purposes, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the title of your conference today includes Diplomacy, Soft Power, and global governance. And I would like to fit an additional puzzle piece into this picture, the rule of law. The way I see it, global governance entails a fabric woven among states that includes treaties, courts, the UN Charter, among other threads of the international system of law. And for this presentation, I'll focus on the role of the Secretary General and international law as a system of both law, written laws, customary law, and norms and values. So when you talk about a whole system of international law, it has to not only be the rules, but also the values behind those rules, which is how we're going to get consent and how we're going to implement these rules that we've written. If there's no will and no belief in the norms, then these whatever rules you write are not going to be implemented. So while I've talked about the Secretary General in general, my specific focus is going to be on Kofi Annan. So in that light, some of you may remember him, but others may not know about him. So Kofi Annan was the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations and the first to be appointed from the ranks of the UN staff. He began his tenure in the post on January 1st, 1997, and completed his 2 terms on December 31st, 2006. So the papers that I'm doing are only for those 10 years that he was Secretary General, not before and not after, even though there may be controversial issues going on before that. He was born in Kumasi, Ghana, on April 8th, 1938, and what was then the British colony called the Gold Coast. Kofi and his twin sister, Efwa Atta, were part of one of the country's elite families. At the age of 16, he left home to attend Infantsipin School, a Methodist boarding school in Cape Coast. He has said that the school taught him the suffering anywhere concerns people everywhere. In 1957, the year that he graduated from high school, Ghana gained its independence from Britain. And Kofi Annan often refers to that time, saying that this gave him tremendous hope that no matter what you need to attain, you can do it, because Ghana got its independence after, years of struggle, and it came when he was, 18 years old. Interestingly enough, also, in an interview with him, he was asked if he had ever had a nickname, and we decided to put this into the papers. And his nickname in high school was Demo. And we said, Demo? What, why Demo? Because he was so excited about democracy that they gave the other students, because he talked about it all the time, that they gave him this nickname, and it became shortened Demo, which is really interesting to see how someone who then became such an important leader started out. He had that energy and enthusiasm very early on. I won't go into all of his past because it would take too much time, but Kofi Annan still remains active in world affairs, as you may know, and in 2008 negotiated the agreement for a coalition government in Kenya that ended the violence following the country's December 2007 presidential elections. He currently directs the Kofi Annan Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland, where he resides with his wife, Nan. What I'd like to focus on are several different aspects of how a Secretary General can promote international law. First, I'll look at how he interprets his own legal authority. And then also how other parts of the UN give him that authority. So how he looks at it and how others look at it. As a developer of norms, such as we know as humanitarian intervention, now called the responsibility to protect, and the universality of human rights. As an interpreter of law, what do we mean by things in the Charter, or how to interpret what's going on in the world in terms of whether it's legal or not legal, to promote the practice of international law, and also as a facilitator in the exercise of international law. So I'm going to touch on each of these things going through. You can watch my time and remind me where I am if I get carried away. Well, in the UN Charter, which is the legal document that sets the Constitution for the United Nations, there is an article, Article 99. Now, some of you may have heard of that, some of you may not have. But that is the article that actually simply states that the Secretary General may bring something to the attention of the Security Council if the Secretary General deems it a threat to international peace and security. Otherwise, in the writing of the Charter, the founding members really thought of the Secretary General as an administrator. You have to have somebody up there, running everything and hiring everybody and making sure it all works. And they didn't really see much of a political role, but they gave him a little political space. So that's Article 99. In the beginning, the very first Secretary General, Trygve Lie, used Article 99. And so he then not only took what was allowed him in the Charter, but planted that space for future Secretaries General. You can use this. And it was accepted by the Security Council and by the General Assembly. So then you had the acceptance of that as a piece of law. Other Secretaries General after him began to use that Article 99, and by the time Kofi Annan came along, people asked him, "Did you ever use Article 99?" He said, "No, I never had the occasion to do it." If you look at the papers, he used it all the time. He just didn't have to say, under Article 99, I have this right. No, he wrote letters constantly to the President of the Security Council and say, "I would like to bring this to your attention." And then you would get the letter back to the Secretary General from the President of the General Assembly saying, "We have taken up this issue and the points that you brought up in your letter have been accepted." So there you go. So he never had to use it because that political space had been created by previous Secretaries General and it was assumed. So you didn't have to say it, but he used it all the time. And that's what is so interesting about the papers. You can, if anybody wants to do research on this, you can just plot it out. The other interesting thing that I came across in the papers was how his ability to initiate international law became recognized and from the International Court of Justice. And this is an incident where the Human Rights Commission at that point had done an investigation into a particular, I'm not going to say the country, a particular country's human rights issues. And they had sent an envoy of the Human Rights Commission to that country to do an investigation, upon which he was promptly arrested. And so everyone was outraged because they said he should have been given diplomatic immunity and that should have been respected by that country. And the case was then taken to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. And what the court decided was the Secretary General has the legal authority to give diplomatic immunity to those people who are representing the UN. So not only does he have Article 99, but now the court has told him he actually can participate in the granting of diplomatic immunity, a legal, proclamation. And so that was another very interesting thing that I found in the papers. as a developer of norms, you find very early on that Kofi Annan was very, very concerned about humanitarian intervention. He had been Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping during the Rwanda crisis and also in Bosnia. And he had seen firsthand, in a massive way, genocide taking place and grave violations of human rights and crimes against humanity. I think he also felt, to some degree, a personal guilt about Rwanda and about Bosnia because he was there. There are many reports to explain what happened, and you can ask that question later if you want to. But as soon as he came in as Secretary General, one of the first things he did is he organized a dinner party. And at that dinner party, when they had finished eating the main course, he said, now I want you to divide up into small groups, and I want you each to talk about humanitarian intervention and what you think about it. And then we're going to come back to the table, and you're going to report back to me. Because he wanted to figure out what people thought about it. And they came back and they spoke to him. Then he was invited to give a talk in London, I think it is, at the Ditchley House, Ditchley Foundation. And he wanted to give it on humanitarian intervention. And he asked Edward Mortimer, who wrote for the Financial Times at that point, to write his speech on humanitarian intervention. And they went back and forth about what he really wanted to say. And that's the first public document that you have on that. And that was very, very early on in his administration. So you see these issues developing. By the time of 1999, when we had Kosovo and we had East Timor, he felt we have to put this in center stage. And he gave a speech here at the UN before the General Assembly, and he wrote an article for The Economist, which is a brilliant article called Two Concepts of Sovereignty, and which parallels his speech at the GA, promoting the concept of humanitarian intervention. After the speech, the backlash was horrendous. Much of the developing world did not agree with him. And they were afraid that the Security Council would now use this to launch a kind of intervention in a repeat of the colonial era. So that was the fear. So Kofi Annan, in an excellent diplomatic move, said, I see we have an issue here. Let's have a report. Let's send it to a committee. And so the Canadians came forward and they said, yes, we'll take this on. And they spent about 2 years coming up with the report Responsibility to Protect. And he said when the title came out that it was brilliant because it changes it from the right to intervene in a humanitarian way to the responsibility to protect. So intervention has a volatile meaning to it. You're going to go in militarily and you're going to use force. Whereas protect has a much more humanitarian view to it. And so he thought the title change was brilliant. But without him pushing this idea, I would argue that we would not have this new norm, which we have been seeing, develop over the last several years. Whether we're there or not, I'm not sure, but at least it's taken up. I'm sure we're actually running out of time. So I wanted to just say one more thing from reading from something that he said, because there's no way that I can repeat it as well as he gave this speech. And this is in June of 1997, so really only 6 months into his first term. And he was asked to give a keynote address at what was then called the Organization of African Unity, the OAU. And this was their meeting at the level of heads of state in Harare, Zimbabwe. And he decided to take a very big risk. And this is what he said. My friends, I speak to you as a fellow African, and I speak to you from the heart. We will succeed to the extent that we embrace the primacy of democratic rule, the inviolability of human rights, and the imperative of sustainable development. Then he goes on to say, the success of Africa's third wave depends equally on respect for fundamental human rights. The conflicts which have disfigured our continent are all too often been accompanied by massive human rights violations. I am aware of the fact that some view this concern as a luxury of the rich countries for which Africa is not ready. I know that others treat it as an imposition, if not a plot, by the industrialized West. I find these thoughts to be truly demeaning of the yearning for human dignity that resides in every African heart. Do not African mothers weep when their sons or daughters are killed or maimed by agents of repressive rule? Are not African fathers saddened when their children are unjustly jailed or tortured? Is not Africa as a whole impoverished when even one of its brilliant voices is silenced? We cannot afford to lose one life, spare one idea, relinquish one hope if we are to succeed in our chosen course. So I say this to you, my brothers and sisters, that human rights are African rights, and I call upon you to ensure that all Africans are able fully to enjoy them. So this crosses this issue as, are human rights universal? And he took the stand that human rights are universal. And that is another way in which he then promulgated and supported the idea of international law and human rights as a very big part of that. So I'll just end there if we want to take some questions. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Krasno, for a very thought-provoking presentation and really an up-and-close view and insight into Kofi Annan and also the role of the Secretary General. So we really appreciated that. I see that Ambassador Kamal has arrived, so I think there we should keep our questions brief, but let's definitely take a round of questions from the audience. We'll start here on the right, and as always, if you could briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. Claire, could you maybe assist a little bit with the camera, just while Darnell has stepped out the video camera, just so we can direct it. We want to make sure we don't, so hold on one second, I want to make sure the video camera gets to you. And then you can pose, and we'll take maybe 3 questions, and then if you could respond, would be great.
My name is Alex Hurst. I'm a political science major at Amherst College in Massachusetts. My question is, even though R2P has advanced considerably from the time of Rwanda to now, do you think there is ever a justification for intervention outside of the United Nations in any situation, given the difficulty of acting based on a consensus model or a Security Council model?
My name is Ryan. I'm a law and public diplomacy student at Syracuse University. I have read Kofi Annan's Concept of Two Sovereignties in at least 3 law classes, and the R2P in at least 2. So from my perspective, that he's a major figure in the shift in balance of sovereignty from national to individual. Do you think that the creation of a norm for R2P will continue that, or do you think it'll hinder it in respects of what's going on in Syria, where there doesn't seem to be actions going to protect?
My name is Dr. Cowan, Director of Global Education, Young Leadership Foundation. Simple question. You mentioned March 19th, the book launching.
Yes.
Are you going to give us more information about it, so perhaps we can come?
Yeah, okay. Well, I teach international law, so I bridge this gap. I'm a political scientist, but I look at the political side of international law. The responsibility to protect is a very big leap in norm creation. And in terms of international law, as my students ask me, there is no law about this now. It's simply a norm. So do we enforce it? Do we not enforce it? There's no law there. So it's simply a norm that's growing. we're hoping, those of us who support this idea, that there is a paradigm shift in the direction of taking greater responsibility for the individual person. So where sovereignty may move away from the nation state if the nation state is unable or unwilling to protect its own citizens. So the idea that then that nation state would lose its sovereignty and that responsibility would fall to the international community to protect those citizens. We saw a great deal of excitement about the responsibility to protect in, I think it was March 17th, when Resolution 1973 was passed, thank you, on Libya, where it actually says in the resolution that there is a responsibility to protect the innocent civilians in Libya from the repression and violence that was being created by the government. And the Security Council passed a resolution allowing a no-fly zone to be created. Plus, there's a lot of other language in there that led to NATO also supporting the revolution itself, which some members of the Security Council had not really anticipated. Others had anticipated it, but others had not. And so when Libya unfolded, many people were surprised at the amount of use of force and the level of the depth of that use of force that went on in Libya, and then ultimately regime change. So when Syria has come up, maybe I'm merging all these different questions. When Syria has come up, in the last several weeks, we saw Russia and China veto the resolution supporting the League of Arab States, their policy for Assad to step down, an interim government to be put into place, and then elections to be held. So the League of Arab States had been promoting that, and what was needed legally would be for the Security Council to authorize that. In the charter, it states that regional organizations have every right to take up an issue in their region, but when it comes to the use of force, they must get the authority of the Security Council before they can use that force. So this was an effort for a regional organization with the backing of the international community to come and get that legal authorization and the legitimacy that would provide. Well, we know that Russia and China vetoed that resolution. So what has been extremely interesting is that last week, and maybe somebody can explain this to me, how they did this, the General Assembly took up the issue of Syria. Now, in the charter, it also says that if the Security Council is what we might call seized of a matter, the General Assembly may not take it up. The GA can take up anything it wants, but not something the Security Council is involved in. And yet, the General Assembly did take it up, and they passed a very extensive resolution supporting the Arab League's proposal. You have to read that language so carefully, the legal parts of it, to get where they're going with this. But the GA passed it. Now, when a resolution is passed in the General Assembly, it is only a recommendation, not law. Resolutions from the Security Council are binding, but not necessarily General Assembly. However, under Uniting for Peace or other ways that you get around the Security Council, the Council has used this now 15 times, where the General Assembly has authorized an action. The first time in 1956 in the Suez Crisis. So it can be done, but it's supposed to be done legally. There are different mechanisms to do that. So can a regional organization take up responsibility to protect? Yes, definitely, just like the Arab League has done. But when it comes to any kind of use of force, meaning sanctions or military force, legally it has to be authorized by the Security Council. So we'll wait and see where we go from there. And then it gets back to the two concepts of sovereignty, where Kofi Annan said, are we going to ignore the massive violations of human rights when he was talking about Kosovo, and get unanimity within the Security Council as the legal authority, or do we respect human rights and violate the law? And we're in that same dilemma now. Okay.
Well, Professor Krasno, thank you very, very much for a thought-provoking lecture as well as a great discussion afterwards. Thank you.